This program was recorded on July 3rd, 2014 on the main campus of Georgetown University, Washington, D.C.
I thought I'd just be talking about John Adams today. But as I thought about what I would say today, and as I was writing, someone else muscled into the conversation. Somebody you know. So I discovered that John Adams would share the stage today with James Madison. And I want to look at both Adams and Madison because they both were vitally important participants in what Thomas Jefferson called an age of experiments in government and what John Adams himself called an age of revolutions and constitutions. I want to illuminate the constructive side of revolution. We tend to think of revolutions as destructive because they overthrow an existing political order and sometimes an existing social order. Not surprisingly, our mental images of revolutions are destructive images. Statues being pulled down, crowds cheering and waving flags in public squares, and of symbols of the old regime being discarded or destroyed. And in fact, one of the first great images of the American Revolution, and of revolution in general, had its roots on July 9, 1776, in the reaction of a New York City crowd to the first public reading in New York of the Declaration of Independence, which was issued 238 years ago tomorrow. As the crowd heard the Declaration read aloud, they began to cheer. And at the reading's end, they marched down Broadway from Old City Hall, which was at Wall and Broad Streets, to Bowling Green, where in the early 1760s, New Yorkers had erected a gilded life-size statue of King George III on horseback. Now, in the 1760s, Americans everywhere boasted that King George III had no more loyal subjects than the inhabitants of British North America. But now, however, things were different. The Declaration made a powerful case against George III as a tyrant, as an integral part of its case for independence. And those who had listened to the reading of the Declaration wanted to express their feelings about their former king. So they threw ropes around the statue, they pulled it down, after which they broke it up to melt it down into ammunition, musket balls and cannonballs. Only one piece of the statue survives today, the horse's tail, which is one of the treasured artifacts of the New York Historical Society. So that illustrates the destructive side of revolution. And we saw it again most recently in Cairo, Tripoli, and Tunis. Crowds pulled down flags, crowds pulled down statues, posters, and other artifacts of the former regime. But as the Arab Spring has taught us, if an uprising is to have any chance of succeeding, and in particular of supplanting the old order, which Tocqueville called the Ancien Régime, and I apologize for my French. If you have any chance to succeed, you don't just get rid of the old order, you have to replace it with something. And therefore, you have to have a revolution with a constructive dimension as well as a destructive dimension. And that's why John Adams' phrase is so apt, an age of revolutions and constitutions. Adams recognized that the American Revolution stood as much for something as it stood against something. It stood for a vision of constitutional government that Americans were determined to defend as much as it stood against a vision of constitutional government that appeared to them to threaten their liberties. Many scholars have highlighted that constructive dimension of the American Revolution, including two people who I'm proud to call my mentors, the late Henry Steele Commager and the late Richard B. Morris. Some see that dimension as giving the American Revolution a conservative character, unlike the destructive upheaval that we know today as the French Revolution. Others see that constructive dimension as making possible not just the democratization of America within a constitutional framework, but eventually the democratization of the rest of the world. You can identify Thomas Jefferson as thinking that, and more recently Gordon Wood in his Radicalism of the American Revolution. I find truth in both perspectives. But sorting out that is not why we're here. I want to talk in particular about the constructive side of the revolution and of the thought and labors of John Adams and James Madison. And this is kind of a constitutional sermon. And I have three texts for my sermon. Actually, maybe four texts for three. I begin with a resolution that was adopted on May 10, 1776 by the Second Continental Congress and was supplemented with a preamble added 5 days later on May 15th. Both the resolution and the preamble were the work of John Adams, who represented Massachusetts in Congress, and whom his peers in Congress and the states knew to be a leading expert on constitutional government. Now, although John Adams was a vigorous defender of the American understanding of American rights and responsibilities under the unwritten British Constitution, at first Adams was not an advocate for independence. Rather, like so many radicals in Congress and elsewhere in America, Adams defended the view that Americans were right in their understanding of the British Constitution and that they would insist on their rights as Englishmen, as subjects of George III, equal in status and in rights to those residing in the mother country. Over time, however, Adams became increasingly aware that the mother country was deaf, maybe willfully so, to the arguments made by Americans such as himself. When, in May 1775, news of the battles of Lexington and Concord reached the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia, Adams decided that the only option left for the Americans was to declare independence. As he saw the matter, Great Britain not only was refusing to heed the arguments of American colonists, but actually was making war against them and shedding their blood. It took Adams over a year of sustained argument, with an increasing number of towns and villages adopting resolutions demanding that Congress declare independence, before the hesitant politicians of the Second Continental Congress recognized that the time was ripe for action. And what particular action? Declaring American independence from Great Britain. One key factor impelling them forward was the dissolution, in some cases the collapse, of the colonial governments. In colony after colony, royal governors dissolved colonial legislatures and then fled. One example, Virginia's Lord Dunmore, even emulated the hated Stuart monarch King James II. Now, in 1689, as James II fled England to avoid arrest and trial for violating his coronation oath, he threw the Great Seal of England into the River Thames. He hoped to prevent his rebellious subjects from making laws. For no bill could become law, even if enacted by both houses of Parliament, without having the Great Seal affixed to it. So, too, in 1776, Lord Dunmore, fleeing Virginia for a ship off the coast, threw the Great Seal of Virginia into the River James for the same purpose. He wanted to prevent the Virginia legislature from making any new laws. Now, in both 1689 and in 1776, neither legislature ground to a halt. Rather, each commissioned the making of a replacement Great Seal, showing the level-headed pragmatism that complemented their commitment to constitutional principle. So in late 1775 and early 1776, as royal governors were dissolving colonial governments, what happens? Self-appointed bodies, provincial congresses, provincial conventions, take the place of the colonial legislatures. Now, in most cases, the members of these provincial congresses and conventions were the members of the old colonial legislatures. But they were self-appointed. They were holding a new role which didn't have any sanction from the people. And they were terrified about this void of legitimacy in constitutional government. So what do we do? Well, a lot of these politicians had served in the First or Second Continental Congresses and had either met or come to learn about John Adams. And they knew he was a great expert on constitutional government. So they wrote him letters. What do we do? What should we do? How best can we create a government? What institutions should it have? Should it be based on a written constitution? And if so, what form should that constitution take? And how should such a constitution be created? Adams's answer to this question took two forms. One form, the official one, was that resolution that he drafted for the Second Continental Congress with its preamble. And I'll read you the text, because Adams was very proud of this. And he always was grumpy that it never got the recognition that he thought it deserved. Whereas His Britannic Majesty, in conjunction with the Lords of Commons of Great Britain, has by a late Act of Parliament excluded the inhabitants of these united colonies from the protection of his crown, and whereas no answer whatsoever to the humble petition of the colonies for redress of grievances and reconciliation with Great Britain has been or is likely to be given, but the whole force of that kingdom, aided by foreign mercenaries, is to be exerted for the destruction of the good people of these colonies, And whereas it appears absolutely irreconcilable to reason and good conscience for the people of these colonies now to take the oaths and affirmations necessary for the support of any government under the Crown of Great Britain, you can tell he's getting worked up, right? I mean, he's getting angry. And it is necessary that the exercise of every kind of authority under the said Crown should be totally suppressed, and all the powers of government exerted under the authority of the people of these colonies for the preservation of internal peace, virtue, and good order, as well as for the defense of their lives, liberties, and properties against the hostile invasions and cruel depredations of their enemies, and that's where the preamble ends. Therefore resolved that it be recommended to the respective assemblies and conventions of the United Colonies, where no government sufficient to the exigencies of their affairs hath been hitherto established, to adopt such government as shall, in the opinion of the representatives of the people, best conduce to the happiness and safety of their constituents in particular, and America in general. Okay. It sounds like independence, doesn't it? Remember that. What's the other thing that Adams wrote? Well, it's a complimentary writing. It's a pamphlet. It began as a letter that he wrote and rewrote, copied and recopied for various politicians all across the 13 colonies from the fall of 1775 through the early spring of 1776. He finally decided that copying the same letter over and over again was not sufficient. Instead, he sat down to write a pamphlet. He took one of the letters and revised it and expanded it and turned it into the pamphlet we know today as Thoughts on Government. Adams had two goals in writing Thoughts on Government. First was to educate his readers about what, in his view, history taught about the best form of government for a free people, a republican, constitutional form of government. The second was to combat the prescription for government set forth in the first American blockbuster bestseller, Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense, which had first appeared in January. Adams valued Paine's case for independence, but he rejected Paine's version of republican government, which concluded the pamphlet as not only foolish, but potentially disastrous. Why? Well, Paine rejected separation of powers and checks and balances. He said these things were overcomplicated and anti-democratic. He argued that these concepts made government too complicated for ordinary people to understand. Further, he insisted, the people would never violate their own rights, which made separation of powers and checks and balances unnecessary. All that a constitutional government required, he concluded, was a one-house legislature representing the people, which could then create courts and executive institutions as these became necessary. Now, Adams found these ideas about constitutional design absurd and destructive. And one reason, and I have to be candid about this, was that Adams was a veteran lawyer and constitutional advocate. And Adams regarded certain assumptions about those subjects as approaching the status of Holy Writ. In his eyes, anyone questioning or challenging those assumptions would be committing a secular version of heresy. How on earth could you say that we don't need separation of powers and checks and balances? Adams just could not get his mind around that. But Adams had another reason to see Paine's version of constitutionalism as dangerous. Unlike Paine, who proudly proclaimed himself an autodidact, a man who taught himself everything, and who one day said, if you burned all the books in the world and began anew with common sense and the rights of man, the world would be better off. Adams, besides being a lover of books, said, no, this is ridiculous. Adams was a learned student of constitutional government in all ages, ancient, medieval, and modern, and in every quarter of the world. Grounding his beliefs about popular constitutional government on his synthesis of the amassed wisdom of human civilization, Adams insisted that separation of powers and checks and balances emerged from history as principles of constitutional government essential to preserving liberty. Government that would be framed along Paine's lines, Adams concluded, would destroy liberty for want of these principles. So in writing Thoughts on Government, Adams set out to teach his readers about the need for, again, republican constitutional government in general, for a form of republican government in particular, blending elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. We'll come back to that. And finally, for a constitutional republic, separating powers and checking and balancing them to preserve liberty. Reading Thoughts on Government makes plain how what Adams called the divine science of politics entranced him. I tell my students that the only thing that got him out of bed besides the divine science of politics was Abigail. He loved the divine science of politics almost as much as he loved Abigail, and he shared that love with her. With care and patience, Adams explained his ideas of the best form of government and the amazing opportunity that 1776 gave to the American people. And here's an extract from Thoughts on Government. You and I, my dear friend, have been sent into life at a time when the greatest lawgivers of antiquity would have wished to have lived. How few of the human race have ever enjoyed an opportunity of making an election of government more than of air, soil, or climate for themselves or their children. When, before the present epoch, had 3 millions of people full power and a fair opportunity to form and establish the wisest and happiest government that human wisdom can contrive. Now, just after he wrote this pamphlet, Adams won what he saw as one of the most important battles he ever fought in his life. Remember that resolution? He got it passed through Congress, and then added in the preamble 5 days later, again approved by Congress. The states now had a mandate from Congress to frame and adopt new constitutions, Republican constitutions. This resolution and its preamble, side by side with Thoughts on Government, show how important Americans in this era found constitutional government and its ideas to be. They also shed light on why Adams later was so vexed about the popularity of the Declaration of Independence and the fame that that document bestowed on its draftsman, Thomas Jefferson. Adams believed with some justice that his resolution was independence itself. Its authorization of new state constitutions was the mechanism by which the colonists ended their allegiance to George III and became free and independent states. And Adams' preamble makes a case, elaborated in the first part of the Declaration, that Americans were driven to independence by the misdeeds of Great Britain in general and George III in particular, just as Jefferson made George III the target of the Declaration 2 months later. Poor Adams was right, but he never really understood how the Declaration became the public symbol of independence and the articulation not just of the case for independence, but of the vision of politics and government at the heart of independent American nationhood. These two documents, Thoughts on Government and that resolution with its preamble, launched the series of what Jefferson called American experiments in government. That process of constitutional experimentation lasted for nearly 2 decades, culminating with the framing and adoption of the U.S. Constitution in 1787-88, and with the framing and adoption of the U.S. Bill of Rights in 1789-91. And now we come to the third and last of my texts for my constitutional sermon. It's James Madison's turn. The Federalist 37 by James Madison, as you know, is one of the 85 essays which we usually mistakenly call the Federalist Papers. The original book was called The Federalist or the New Constitution. That title, The Federalist Papers, was an invention sometime in the mid-20th century. The Federalist started as a newspaper column in New York City's newspapers from October 87 through July 88. In the spring of 1788, John and Archibald MacLean published the whole series in 2 volumes. In fact, the last 8 essays appeared first in the book and then in the newspapers. Volume 1 contained the first 36 essays, which advocated preserving the Union, demonstrated that the Articles of Confederation were too weak to preserve the Union, and urged the adoption of a government that could preserve the Union that was at least as strong as that sketched by the proposed Constitution. Number 37 is the first essay in Volume 2, and it begins the case for the Constitution itself. Jack Rakove at Stanford, who's a leading historian of the making of the Constitution and one of the greatest living experts on James Madison, has argued that the Federalist number 37 is an unjustly neglected classic, and I agree. This essay is about the challenge of writing a constitution. We can read it as a counterpart to Thoughts on Government, which is a guide to how to write a constitution. Madison's essay is an explanation of how difficult it is to write a constitution, in particular, a constitution for an extended republic such as the United States. In his essay, Madison explored all sorts of reasons why the proposed constitution fell short of being a perfect document. He established three categories for those reasons. First, the novelty of the tasks to be tackled by its framers. Second, Gesundheit, the range of ideas and interests to be accommodated in creating the document. And third, and this is my favorite part, the difficulty of using human language to order the political world. And now I will let James Madison have his say. Besides the obscurity arising from the complexity of objects and the imperfection of the human faculties, the medium through which the conceptions of man are conveyed to each other adds a fresh embarrassment. The use of words is to express ideas. Perspicuity, therefore, requires not only that the ideas should be distinctly formed, but that they should be expressed by words distinctly and exclusively appropriate to them. But no language is so copious as to supply words and phrases for every complex idea, or so correct as not to include many, equivocally denoting different ideas. Hence it must happen that however accurately objects may be discriminated in themselves, and however accurately the discrimination may be considered, the definition of them may be rendered inaccurate by the inaccuracy of the terms in which it is delivered. And this unavoidable inaccuracy must be greater or less according to the complexity and novelty of the objects defined. And he ends this passage with one of the most astounding sentences written by any of the founding guys. When the Almighty himself condescends to address mankind in their own language, his meaning, luminous as it must be, is rendered dim and doubtful by the cloudy medium through which it is communicated. In other words, the human language defeats even the Almighty. Jacques Derrida, eat your heart out. James Madison saw it first. Now, Adams and Madison are two of the masters of constitutional theory and two of the greatest constitution makers in history. What do they have in common and what divides them? That's the subject of the concluding, say, third of what I'm saying. The great legal historian Bill Nelson asked me this question in the NYU Legal History Colloquium, and I'm still pondering it, and what I'm doing with you today is giving a first take on some of my answers. There's one central difference between the politics of their time and that of our time, and that is that Adams, Madison, and their contemporaries confronted a constellation of issues and challenges that required them to practice a very special, different kind of politics. And they faced four great challenges in roughly chronological order. First, defending constitutional liberty within an existing constitutional framework, the British Constitution. Second, declaring and achieving independence from that old constitutional framework. Third, devising new constitutional frameworks at state and national levels. And fourth, finally, administering and road testing those new frameworks at the same time. Now, these tasks all required politicians to think on two different, distinct levels. The first being that of day-to-day practical politics, confronting issues as they arise, and second, that of abstract constitutional and political principle. And at the same time, they had to maintain the link between thought and action, between those two levels of political thought and action. In sum, the demands of launching the American constitutional experiment required a special kind of politician, not an abstract political thinker like John Locke, David Hume, or Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but a thinking politician. And in the great ideological and constitutional battles in which Adams, Madison, and their contemporaries engaged, we can see these remarkable and indispensable thinking politicians at work. Now, even though they were both thinking politicians, Adams and Madison took two different approaches to the problems confronting them and their identification of the challenges to any would-be creator of constitutional government for the United States. One major difference between them is that between the comparative political scientist, and that's John Adams, and the political technologist, and that's James Madison. One of the great Adams scholars was the late historian Stephen Kurtz. He argued nearly half a century ago in a wonderful short article, it's the best thing on Adams' political thought I've ever read, that John Adams was not trying to be original or creative. He sought only to synthesize the world's conventional wisdom about human nature, society, politics, and government, and then to apply that synthesis to the American situation. Adams wanted to ensure that American constitution making applied the principles guiding the best forms of government. By contrast, the little guy, James Madison, was bent on doing something else. He was bent on pushing beyond the conventional wisdom and even turning it on its head to make possible the new American experiments in government. The famous example is Federalist number 10, where Madison says that a diversity of factional interests would not destroy an extended republic, but rather would help to preserve it. So that's one big difference between Adams and Madison. The man who's intent on sticking with what we know versus the man who's trying to push beyond it. Here's another one. Their intellectual assumptions were different. John Adams was a close student of classical political thought. Central to classical political thought were the three pure forms of government: monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. I told you they'd come back. And the ways they could be blended to create a republic. For Adams, the central political problem of constitutional design was aristocracy. Adams argued that in aristocracy, a small group of people claiming elite status and seeking distinction and power would emerge in every society, no matter how it was constituted. Unless, he continued, a society's founders took pains to do two complementary things, aristocracy would take over. So what are these two things? First, build into the constitutional system an institution representing the aristocracy that gives them a clear but limited role in politics. Second, surround that institution with checks and balances to ensure that the government's institutions can rein in the aristocracy and prevent aristocracy from taking over the whole system. Now, there's a common view of John Adams as an apologist for aristocracy and as a defender of monarchy, or both. And I think that vision of Adams is fatally flawed. As the son of a farmer and shoemaker, who often called himself Farmer John of Braintree, and who loved getting his hands dirty and prided himself on his manure piles, John Adams was no apologist for aristocracy. Rather, he was a cold, clear-eyed student of aristocracy and of the best ways to use it and to restrain it. So too, Adams was no friend of monarchy. As a learned student of political theory, Adams believed that monarchy was a default position for government, a view shared by people like Montesquieu, Voltaire, Hume, and others whom he studied. When challenged, Adams rejected imputations that he favored monarchy or aristocracy, but he still insisted that we need to understand both. Thus, Adams understood and embraced not only classical political thought, but what we can see as its vertical conception of a society. Monarchy, aristocracy, democracy. One, few, many. The terms that English analysts used for the king, the House of Lords, the House of Commons. One, few, and many. That looks like a ladder. It looks like a pyramid, doesn't it? And that's John Adams' classical ladder conception of society. Now, when I was talking to one of my closest friends, and one thing, if you guys ever decide to write a book, make sure you run your manuscript by someone whose intellect you trust, but who does not have special training in your field. An intelligent general reader. Those people are gold. And I have a friend who was listening to my description of John Adams' ideas about aristocracy, and she asked me, so is John Adams the theorist of the 99%? And I laughed and I said, well, I'm not sure. I do know this, that the radical sociologist C. Wright Mills wrote an amazing book, still valuable and relevant today, called The Power Elite, in which he quotes John Adams with great respect and admiration no fewer than 8 times, at length. You know, a lot of people say, oh, C. Wright Mills, he was a Marxist. We don't listen to him. But C. Wright Mills is listening to John Adams as much as he's listening to Karl Marx. So that might reshape what we think of C. Wright Mills and John Adams. Also, more recently, someone whom you've probably seen on television, the political commentator and author Kevin Phillips, wrote a book a few years ago called American Aristocracy, in which, in his concluding chapter, he said, the only founding father to understand the great dangers of aristocracy, which is what his whole book was about, was John Adams. And Kevin Phillips points out, for example, how generations of political families, the Kennedys, the Cuomos, the Murkowskis in Alaska, the Bushes in Texas or Florida, generations of political office holders take office. Why? In many respects, because the voters look for brand names in voting. And that is how you create an aristocracy, isn't it? Now, once I presented some of these ideas about John Adams and aristocracy, and Peter Onuf, who is mentor to all of us who work on Thomas Jefferson, decided to challenge me. Peter asked, well, why did Adams think that aristocracy would only limit itself to the institution intended to represent it? Why would they obediently troop into the Senate, for example, and not take over the House and the presidency? And I said, I had 3 parts to my answer. First, Adams believed that if checks and balances held, if the other institutions stood up, then the aristocracy's chances of taking them all over would not come true. Second, Adams, I think, believed that people would see classical political thought the way he would see it. And they would say, oh no, we're going to vote for representatives of us, for the organization representing the people, and for the really super elite for the presidency, and we're not going to allow the aristocracy to take everything over. But third, Adams never thought that any constitution would be permanent. Rather, he argued, we would have to make periodic recourse to first principles to ensure that corruption and decay do not destroy the constitutional system. And now we turn from Adams to James Madison, who has a very different view of things. James Madison was a key figure of the movement in American thought that rejected classical political theory. Madison held that the titanic changes represented by the American Revolution created a new political world in which aristocracy was no longer relevant, and classical political theory was no longer relevant. Though in the Federalist number 10, Madison does identify economic interests as the most durable source of factional strife, which might fit Adams' analysis of aristocracy, Madison saw a different pivotal challenge to American constitution making, a problem that Adams never confronted. For Madison, the central problem was not aristocracy, but geography, the extended republic. And the central challenge facing constitution makers was to devise a solution to the problem of a republican government for a large nation. Madison's solution took the form we know today as constitutional federalism. Madison did not share Adams's vertical understanding of society and politics. Instead, Madison took a horizontal geographical approach to politics and to constitutional design. Now, it shouldn't be surprising that Madison, instead of Adams, saw the extended republic, federalism, and the relationship between them. Adams missed the boat. He wasn't present for the arguments in America about issues arising from the size and extent of the United States. Don't forget that from 1777 to 1788, Adams was in Europe, with only a couple of short gaps in that service. By contrast, Madison regularly faced such issues throughout his political career, for they pervaded the work of the Continental and Confederation Congresses when he served in them. Further, as a veteran Virginia politician who had to deal with the diverse, factious politics of the nation's largest state, Madison again had to confront ideas about extended republics even before he had to face them in preparing for the Federal Convention. And then, of course, Adams wasn't at the Federal Convention. Madison was. He didn't miss a day. His preoccupation with the extended republic shows up during the Federal Convention. And then also it helps to explain something. In the opening weeks of the convention, Madison, like so many of the other delegates, went to the Library of Company of Philadelphia and checked books out to read. And Madison checked out Volume 1, which is the only one out, of John Adams' Defense of the Constitutions of Government of the United States. He read it, and then he wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson in which he included a grumble about Adams's book. Adams wrote eventually a 3-volume work distilling the wisdom of the ages to educate his readers about the need for checks and balances to restrain aristocracy in a constitutional system. But Adams was silent on federalism and the extended republic. Instead, he yielded to his preoccupation with aristocracy and the lessons of classical political thought. So on June 6, 1787, during the Federal Convention's second week, this is what Madison wrote to Jefferson about Adams's book. Men of learning find nothing new in it. Men of taste, many things to criticize. And men without either, not a few things which they will not understand. Would you want that on the back cover of your book? No. Madison, I think, was frustrated that a great study of comparative government by a leading thinking politician from which he hoped to learn said nothing about the problems that Madison thought paramount. So in the convention, Madison had to deal with these problems in wrestling with such matters as the formula for representation in both houses of Congress, the means of electing the president, and the boundaries between federal and state constitutional powers. These issues continued to arise during the ratification controversy in 87-88. In writing his essays in the Federalist, Madison discussed federalism and the extended republic. And during the early years of the new constitutional system, as the administration's floor leader in the House of Representatives, again, Madison keeps coming back to these issues. By contrast, in 1789 to 1797, poor John Adams is stuck in the vice presidency, unable to sit in cabinet meetings, unable to take part in congressional debates, and unable, as he had hoped, to become the administration's spokesman in the Senate. And those of you who saw the famous miniseries starring Paul Giamatti will remember poor Paul Giamatti as John Adams muttering to himself because the senators don't want to hear from him. Further, during his term as president in 1797 to 1801, Adams really didn't have much exposure to issues of federalism. As far as we know, in fact, he never read the Federalist until 1818. Why 1818? Because in 1818, Washington, D.C. publisher Jacob Gideon issued a new edition of the Federalist, supported and assisted by James Madison, and sent a presentation copy to John Adams. And if you look at the John Adams books in the collection of the Boston Public Library, the one copy of the Federalist is the presentation edition sent by Jacob Gideon. And we have no other trace that Adams read the Federalist before that point. So what do we do about this? I propose to you, and this is my concluding proposal, that we have to view Adams and Madison in complementary ways. And again, this argument is based on conversations with that friend who I talked about, who is no expert in our field, yet who sees things clearly because she stands outside expert knowledge. So not only can we see Adams as a vertical political constitutional theorist, and Madison as a horizontal political constitutional theorist, another point is worth making. In my friend's words, don't we need them both? And I remember when she said that, my jaw dropped, and I said, say that again. And she said, don't we need them both? And I scribbled it down, and I went through and I did a literature search, and so far as I could tell, nobody has said that. Most people follow the lead of Gordon Wood in chapter 14 on John Adams in his book, The Creation of the American Republic, which basically says Adams missed the boat. He missed the great change in American political thought, and he's on the sidelines. And the only reason we should pay attention to him is that he was not a devotee of American exceptionalism, but a realist. Now, Gordon Wood is right about that latter part. But I think if we combine looking at Adams and Madison and seeing them as complementary. We get past the old vision of Adams as a prisoner of classical political thought who did not grasp the new American political world. And we get past the veneration exclusively of James Madison because he saw it better than Adams, and thus he's the key figure in defining what we should be thinking about. I submit that choosing between them is a false choice, and the classic example of the excluded middle. For as Kevin Phillips and C. Wright Mills have reminded us, the problems of aristocracy are not obsolete relics of bygone ages. They are with us now, and we haven't paid attention. We should not reject Adams for Madison, nor should we reject Madison for Adams. Rather, we ought to pay attention to both the vertical and the horizontal dimensions of American politics and both kinds of problems of constitutional governance. Nor need we embrace the radical arguments about aristocracy and entrenched economic and political power offered either by the Occupy movement on the left or the Tea Party movement on the right. Instead, we ought to see Adams and Madison side by side, complementing each other in their engagement with the problems of politics and the ways of solving them through creating and administering constitutional systems. In conclusion, let me come back to those three documents that were the text of this constitutional sermon. I suggest that we should think about those documents as enabling us to illuminate in unfamiliar ways familiar parts of the old story of the creation of the United States and its constitutional system. We can use that 1776 resolution drafted by John Adams in tandem with the Declaration of Independence to think about two different ways of achieving the same goal, reflecting the approaches of two political allies with different ways of conceiving and solving the same political and constitutional problem. We can use thoughts on government as a way into the intellectual world of the founding guys in general, and John Adams in particular, to show a man for whom constitutionalism, constitutions, and comparative government were abiding fascinations and necessary subjects, and to show how these fascinations had urgent practical implications and consequences. We can also use it to gain entry into the workshop of the Constitution maker, to understand how Constitution makers see ideas and words as the equivalent of the carpenter's hammers and saws and planes. And finally, we can use the Federalist number 37 to get past taking the Constitution and its creation for granted, to gain entry in a different way to the Constitution's maker's workshop, to show how hard the task of constitutional creation is, how it carries no guarantees of success, and how much thought and care must go into that task. Thank you.